Hello, today is Monday, March 3rd. Welcome to episode 421 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. I'm NSI Advisory Board member Lester Munson. I'm joined today by, Return of the King, NSI founder and executive director Jamil N. Jaffer, NSI Senior Fellow Morgan Vigna, and NSI Fellow and former Deputy Executive Director Jessica Jones. Okay, what should we talk about, guys? Anything going on? For those of you who may have been in a coma, there was a rather dramatic meeting in the Oval Office on Friday between President Trump of the United States, President Zelensky of Ukraine, J.D. Vance, who is the Vice President of the United States, and several others. Terrific television, as President Trump noted, but perhaps bad national security outcome in that there was a huge breach between Trump and Zelensky on the future of negotiations over Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how all of that will be sorted out over the next few weeks and months. Very dramatic disagreements over the role of Russia, disagreements over whether Russia would abide by a deal. There may be a very deep issue here of whether Zelensky and the Ukrainians are willing to sign up for President Trump's vision of a ceasefire and then long-term deal with Russia, perhaps without specific American security guarantees, but an economic deal between the U.S. and Ukraine involving strategic minerals and things like that. So, Jones, I want to go to you first here, and let's rather than kind of run back through the amazing drama of Friday, let's try to take a forward look here. Since the blow up, Zelensky has gone to London. He had a very warm reception by Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister. There is now a meeting of a coalition of the willing of Europeans and Canadians who are going to support Ukraine in light of this breach with Washington. How is that going to play going forward? Can Zelensky get back into an arrangement with the Trump administration that will help bolster this idea that Europe will provide the security guarantees for a peace deal here? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'd first like to apologize. We talked about this White House meeting on Friday, and we called it a Fun Friday episode, not knowing kind of that the meeting would go off the rails a bit. So we predicted a little wrong there. But, just stepping back for a minute, we discussed both sides walking into that conversation kind of needing a deal, right? And so we kind of predicted a smoother afternoon than that what came out. And I think what we see is that the Trump administration and Zelensky and potentially the Europeans see this issue and the path forward very differently. I walked away from, the discussion on Friday thinking that, President Trump is looking this more as a potential acquisition deal than it is about European security, right? The emphasis on the minerals. And as much as Secretary Rubio talked about diplomacy, I'm not seeing a lot of diplomacy happening, more kind of corporate lingo. And Zelensky still, it looks like he's living in a, post-Trump second administration world where, sovereignty and, seeing Putin's duplicity is a natural given, right? So he seemed a little bit surprised at I think, some of the comments made in the meeting. And so I think we make fun of the Europeans a bit on this show, and their inability to unite, to come up with a coherent foreign policy, the bickering, but they really have an opportunity at this moment. We've been talking about it the last couple of weeks, especially after the Munich Security Council, to step up, right, to actually come up with a foreign policy to support Ukraine. We've heard comments for the last couple of weeks potentially about European nations stationing troops in Ukraine after a potential ceasefire. We've talked about maybe nuclear, umbrella share. We've talked about a lot of things. So I think this is their moment to actually come forward. I think what will be interesting is if we do see more unity on the part of the Europeans, what happens when their policies conflict with that of the United States? We're kind of disengaged from the conversation with our allies. And if you're not in the conversation, you're not influencing the conversation. So what happens if whether it's about Ukraine or whether it's about the Middle East, what happens if we actually find ourselves at loggerheads?
Jamil, I recall a time not too long ago when you were negotiating a lot of things for Senate Republicans in discussions with Senate Democrats. What's your sense of the negotiating table right now, and how are things going to play out between Washington and Kyiv and Moscow at this point?
Well, there's no question that Zelensky's got to come back to the table and find a way back to the table because he needs he needs the United States in this deal. No matter how much the Europeans get in, no matter how committed they are, they can't do this deal on their own, and Zelensky can't get a deal on his own. That being said, to your point, I'm not sure he wants a deal. And to the extent he doesn't want a deal, he knows that Trump needs a deal. And because Trump needs a deal, he thinks he has some negotiating leverage. Whether he's right or wrong about that, we'll find out. But at a minimum, he's going to have to come back. He's going to have to eat some crow at some level, even though I don't think he actually deserves it. In a lot of ways, I actually think this meeting in some ways was a setup. I know a lot of people have suggested that, but I actually think that Trump was goading him throughout that entire meeting, even though it looked like he was being you know accommodating. Trump at the at the end, it was still sticking the knife in Zelensky every opportunity he got. And so, look, I think Zelensky's going to have to come back to the table, but Trump does need this deal, and the longer Zelensky holds on, the longer Zelensky keeps fighting, the longer Zelensky keeps Ukrainian troops in Kursk, the more Donald Trump loses face, and he's going to need to deal too.
Vina, what are your thoughts?
Oh, so many. First, I'd like to give a call out to George Jennison. Yes, George, we are revisiting Ukraine, so I hope I hope this
Our biggest fan.
Exactly. So first, Trump and Zelensky see the world very differently. There is a lot of history between these two men, and they don't necessarily, it's not necessarily a warm and fuzzy history, but nevertheless, they are forced to forced to negotiate, forced to work together based on the fact that we've got this, 3 years long war in Ukraine, and Trump has pledged that he'd be able to turn it off in 24 hours, right? So I think Trump is now sort of committed to finding some sort of path towards peace, whatever that may look like. With that said, though, I do think it's interesting that Trump is more focused and has prioritized placating Russia and getting Russia on board with a peace deal, and actually taking pretty extraordinary steps to do so. And I think he's just sort of assumed that Zelensky is going to fall in line, sign this mineral deal, and we'll worry about security guarantees another time. As Trump said, oh, that's only 2% of the issue here. So I do think when Zelensky did push back in that Oval Office setting, J.D. Vance and Trump saw an opportunity to sort of jump all over him and say that he's ungrateful for U.S. support, which, by the way, has actually played very well with a certain segment of the American people. A lot of Americans have actually, criticized Zelensky for not being more grateful for U.S. support. And I don't necessarily think that he is, but nevertheless, that sort of call out by Trump definitely attracted a lot of attention.
All right. I'm going to do something that I really try to avoid doing on this podcast. And I'm going to agree with Jamil. I think there's a real... I know. This is amazing news. There's a real breach between where Trump is and where Zelensky is. And I think to Jamil's point, Trump needs this deal way more than he's admitting or he's making it look like. And I think one of the reasons this thing blew up so badly in the Oval is because Trump knows there's a lot on the line for his credibility. And yes, it's popular right now, but as this thing plays out longer and longer, it's going to get harder and harder for him to justify being out of the game and not having a role while folks like Keir Starmer are stepping up and doing the right thing. And so I think what there's going to have to be is some sort of maybe tacit understanding behind the scenes that there will be some kind of American security guarantees to back up the European plan, which will be the real guarantee at the end of the day, in addition to this kind of mystical mineral deal that supposedly will tie our two economies together. So I think Jamil's right, and in the grand scheme of the negotiation, Trump has more of his credibility on the line than Zelensky does. Okay, that's a wrap. Thanks so much to Kelly Crowley, Claude Jennings, the NSI staff for their help in producing today's episode. Join us on Wednesday, March 5, for another episode of Fault Lines, National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. We're on YouTube. Check out our channel. If you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.